What would you do if the road you were driving on started calling your name, letter by letter, sign by sign, trapping you in a loop that defies every law of physics and reality? Veteran trucker Marcus Holloway thought he knew every highway in America, but on one freezing November night, Interstate 77 had other plans for him, plans that would challenge everything he believed about the world, about technology, and about the very nature of existence itself. Before we dive into this terrifying journey, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our spine-chilling trucker tales. And after you hear what happened to Marcus, drop a comment below telling us what state or country you're watching from. We love hearing from our community spread across the globe, and who knows, your hometown might be closer to this nightmare than you think. Marcus Holloway had been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture across the continental United States, logging over 3 million miles without a single serious incident. He was the kind of driver other truckers respected, the kind who knew when to push through and when to pull over, who could read weather patterns like ancient sailors read the stars, and who treated his rig like it was an extension of his own body. But on November 14, 2024, Marcus accepted a rush delivery that would take him through the Appalachian Mountains during what meteorologists were calling an unprecedented cold snap, temperatures plummeting to record lows. And that decision would lead him into an experience that no amount of road experience could have prepared him for. He was hauling industrial equipment from Charlotte to Columbus, a route he had driven dozens of times before, always taking Interstate 77 through the mountains, a stretch of highway known for its challenging curves and elevation changes, but never for anything supernatural or unexplained. Marcus had laughed at the younger drivers who swapped ghost stories at truck stops, tales of phantom hitchhikers and mysterious lights in the night, dismissing them as the products of exhaustion and overactive imaginations fueled by too much caffeine and too little sleep. The trouble started around 11:30 p.m. when Marcus was approximately 40 miles north of the Virginia border, cruising through a particularly isolated section of Interstate 77, where cell phone signals became spotty and gas stations were few and far between, the kind of stretch where truckers learned to fill up beforehand and double-check their equipment. His GPS, a top-of-the-line commercial unit he had installed just 6 months earlier, suddenly displayed a notification that an alternate route was available, promising to save him 17 minutes despite the fact that Marcus could not imagine any faster route through these mountains, having traveled this exact highway more times than he could count. The device's synthetic voice, usually calm and predictable, seemed somehow different, carrying an urgency that made Marcus glance at the screen with more attention than usual. And he noticed that the recommended detour did not appear on his trucking atlas, which he always kept as a backup because technology could fail, but paper maps never lied. Against his better judgment, perhaps influenced by the promise of getting to his destination before the forecasted snowstorm hit the region, Marcus followed the GPS instruction to take the next exit, a ramp that seemed narrower than standard highway exits, barely wide enough for his rig to navigate without his mirrors coming dangerously close to the guardrails on either side. The exit led him onto what appeared to be a service road that ran parallel to the main interstate, poorly lit and covered with patches of ice that made Marcus reduce his speed to 35 miles per hour, his headlights cutting through the darkness and revealing absolutely nothing but empty road stretching ahead into the void. He drove for approximately 8 miles before the GPS instructed him to merge back onto Interstate 77, which struck Marcus as odd because the detour had not saved any time at all. In fact, he had lost nearly 10 minutes navigating the dangerous service road at reduced speed. As his truck climbed back onto the interstate, Marcus noticed a green highway sign illuminated by his headlights, one of those standard reflective signs that indicate distance to the next city. But something about it caught his attention, made him squint through the windshield trying to read the letters that seemed to be arranged in an unusual pattern. The sign read, Marcus Holloway, 42 miles, which made absolutely no sense, because highway signs displayed city names, not personal names, and certainly not the name of the person reading them at that exact moment. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the freezing temperatures outside his heated cab, and he immediately dismissed what he saw as exhaustion playing tricks on his eyes. Perhaps the letters had actually spelled something else, and his tired brain had rearranged them into something familiar, a phenomenon he had heard about but never personally experienced. He continued driving, maintaining his speed at 60 miles per hour, the maximum he felt comfortable with given the icy patches appearing more frequently on the road surface, and he tried to focus on the white lines marking the lanes, using them as a meditation technique to keep himself alert and present. 15 minutes passed without incident. Just the steady hum of his diesel engine and the occasional crackle from his CB radio picking up fragments of conversations from other truckers too far away for clear communication. And then he saw another sign, this one indicating an upcoming rest area in 37 miles. Except the letters were wrong again, scrambled into a configuration that spelled Marcus, 37 miles, as if the highway itself was counting down something specifically for H.M. Now Marcus was fully alert, his heart rate increasing as he considered the possibilities. Either he was experiencing some kind of medical emergency, perhaps a stroke or hallucination brought on by carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty exhaust system, or something genuinely inexplicable was happening around him, something that defied rational explanation. He grabbed his CB radio and tried to raise any other drivers in the area, broadcasting on channel 19, the standard trucker frequency, calling out his position and asking if anyone else was experiencing unusual occurrences on Interstate 77, but he received nothing but static in response, not even the usual background chatter that filled the airwaves on most nights. Marcus checked his cell phone and found it had no signal whatsoever, displaying those dreaded words, "no service," despite the fact that this section of highway usually had at least 1 or 2 bars of coverage from the regional carrier he used, and when he tried to use the phone's GPS as a backup, the application refused to load, spinning endlessly without displaying any map data. The temperature gauge on his dashboard indicated it was -8 degrees outside, cold enough that stopping to investigate would be dangerous if his truck failed to restart, cold enough that exposure could lead to serious consequences within minutes. So Marcus decided to keep driving forward, trusting that eventually he would reach a town or truck stop where he could get help, or at least verify that he was not losing his mind. Another 10 miles passed, and another sign appeared, this one supposedly indicating the next exit, but the letters had rearranged themselves again, now reading, Holloway Loops Forever, 20 miles, which was not even grammatically similar to any standard highway sign Marcus had ever encountered, and the deliberate use of his last name combined with the word loops sent a wave of genuine fear through his body, the kind of primal fear that ancestors felt when they heard predators moving in the darkness beyond their campfires. Marcus tried every rational explanation his mind could produce. Faulty GPS updates displaying corrupted data, some kind of elaborate prank involving highway sign manipulation, though he could not imagine who would have the resources or motivation to pull off such a thing in the middle of nowhere. Or perhaps he had accidentally ingested something at the last truck stop where he had eaten dinner, some contaminated food that was causing vivid hallucinations while his body fought off poisoning. He pinched his arm hard enough to leave a mark, slapped his face twice, opened his window to let the freezing air blast his senses into heightened awareness. But everything felt completely real, completely solid, and the signs kept appearing at regular intervals, each one displaying some variation of his name or some cryptic message that seemed designed specifically to unsettle him, to make him question his perception of reality. The GPS, which had been relatively quiet since directing him onto this nightmare road, suddenly announced with that unsettling urgency in its synthetic voice, in 13 miles, take exit 94 toward Marcus Hollow, and Marcus nearly drove off the road when he heard his name incorporated into the GPS directions themselves, spoken aloud by the machine that had been his faithful companion for thousands of miles. He immediately reached for the power button, intending to shut the device down completely and rely on his own knowledge of the highway system. But when he pressed the button, nothing happened. The screen remained brightly lit, showing a map that looked increasingly wrong, displaying a highway that curved and twisted in ways that Interstate 77 simply did not curve or twist, forming almost a spiral pattern that centered on a point labeled with his initials MH in bold letters. At exactly the 13-mile mark, Marcus saw exit 94 approaching, and he made the split-second decision to ignore it completely, to stay on the main highway regardless of what the GPS commanded, exercising his free will against whatever force seemed to be manipulating his route. But as he passed the exit ramp, his truck shuddered violently, not from any mechanical issue, but as if the vehicle itself was protesting his choice, and the temperature inside his cab suddenly dropped 20 degrees in a matter of seconds, his breath becoming visible in white clouds despite the heater running at maximum capacity. The windshield began to frost over from the inside, an impossibility that Marcus understood immediately was not natural, not explainable by any meteorological phenomenon, and he frantically scraped at the ice with his gloved hand while trying to maintain control of 18 tons of truck and cargo, traveling at highway speed. Through the small clear patch he managed to create on the windshield, Marcus saw the most disturbing sight yet. The road ahead appeared to be the exact same stretch of highway he had driven 20 minutes earlier, with the same distinctive curve around a rocky outcropping, the same pattern of reflectors embedded in the road surface, even the same dead tree on the shoulder that he had noticed earlier because of its distinctive lightning-split trunk. He checked his odometer and saw that he had definitely traveled over 30 miles since seeing that tree, so either there were two identical dead trees with identical lightning damage, or somehow he had looped back to the same location without making any turns, without any apparent mechanism for such a thing to occur on a straight interstate highway. Marcus felt his professional composure beginning to crack, replaced by something approaching panic, the kind of panic that made people do irrational things, abandon their vehicles, run into the wilderness, make choices that got them classified as missing persons who were never found. He forced himself to breathe deeply, to think through the situation logically, and he decided that the only reasonable course of action was to stop at the next opportunity, assess his situation, check his truck for any mechanical issues that might be causing disorientation, and try to re-establish communication with the outside world. The next sign appeared, glowing with an intensity that seemed too bright for standard reflective material, reading, "Rest area 8 miles, face your loop Marcus," and the inclusion of what appeared to be a direct command aimed at him personally made his hands tighten on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white beneath his work gloves. The rest area appeared exactly 8 miles later, marked by a blue sign that for once displayed normal text without his name, though Marcus noticed that the facility's name was listed as Holloway Rest Area, which seemed like too much of a coincidence given his last name. But at this point, coincidence seemed like a quaint concept from a simpler reality that no longer applied to his current situation. He guided his rig into the truck parking section, which was completely empty despite this being a major interstate route where rest areas usually hosted at least a few sleeping truckers at any hour, and the absence of any other vehicles struck him as both a relief and deeply unsettling, leaving him alone with whatever was happening, but also without witnesses or potential help. Marcus engaged his parking brake and sat in the cab for several minutes, engine idling, heater struggling to maintain temperature against the unnatural cold that seemed to be seeping into his vehicle from some source other than the frigid November air outside. He examined the rest area through his windows. Standard concrete building with restrooms and vending machines, covered picnic tables crusted with ice, information boards presumably displaying maps and tourist attraction pamphlets, everything appearing completely normal and mundane under the yellow sodium vapor lights that illuminated the facility. Nothing moved in the parking lot. No wind disturbed the frost patterns on the pavement. No animals darted through the shadows, creating an atmosphere of absolute stillness that felt wrong in ways Marcus struggled to articulate even to himself. Finally, Marcus made the decision to exit his truck and investigate, reasoning that sitting paralyzed by fear would accomplish nothing, and that he needed to take some kind of action to break free from whatever loop or trap had ensnared him. He bundled into his heavy winter jacket, pulled on insulated gloves and a wool cap, and opened his door to step out into the shocking cold that hit him like a physical force. Temperatures that should not exist at this elevation and latitude, cold that burned his lungs when he inhaled and formed ice crystals on his beard within seconds. He jogged toward the restroom building, partly to minimize exposure, and partly because movement felt like resistance against the oppressive atmosphere that weighted everything around him. Inside the restroom, Marcus found everything functioning normally, running water that was actually warm, working lights, paper towels in the dispensers, even a faint smell of industrial cleaning products suggesting recent maintenance, all signs of ordinary civilization that should have been comforting but somehow felt like a facade, like a movie set designed to appear normal while hiding something fundamentally wrong behind the walls. He splashed water on his face, stared at his reflection in the mirror above the sink, and saw exactly what he expected. A 47-year-old man with weathered features, graying beard, bloodshot eyes from too many hours behind the wheel. Nothing supernatural, nothing changed, just himself looking frightened in ways he had not been frightened since childhood nightmares about monsters under the bed. When Marcus walked back outside, he immediately noticed that his truck had moved, not by much, perhaps 15 feet closer to the rest area building than where he had parked it, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had engaged the parking brake, had felt it lock into position, had heard the characteristic click that confirmed engagement. He approached his rig cautiously, circling it to check for any signs of mechanical failure or external interference, and that was when he noticed the frost patterns on his trailer, intricate crystalline formations that seemed to form letters, spelling out fragments of words. Loop, return, endless, Marcus, appearing and disappearing as his breath disturbed the delicate ice structures. Marcus climbed back into his cab and immediately tried every communication method available to him, starting with his CB radio, which now produced not just static, but what sounded almost like voices speaking backwards, phonemes and syllables that were recognizably human, but arranged in sequences that formed no comprehensible language. And occasionally, through the distortion, he thought he heard his own name repeated in whispers that might have been imagination, or might have been something else entirely. His cell phone remained useless, displaying no service, despite him now holding it directly against the window, trying different positions and angles to catch any possible signal from any possible tower. But the device might as well have been a decorative brick for all the connectivity it provided. The truck's satellite communication system, typically reserved for emergency contact with his dispatcher and guaranteed to work anywhere on the continent with clear view of the sky, activated, but displayed only a single message repeated infinitely on its small screen: position undefined, latitude error, longitude error, altitude ambiguous, coordinates recursive, location paradox, which was not any error code Marcus had ever encountered in his decades of using various fleet management systems. He tried to manually override the system and send a distress call, but every attempt resulted in the same recursive error message, as if his truck existed in a space that mapping systems could not properly categorize or describe. Desperate for any kind of outside contact, Marcus decided to physically examine the information boards he had noticed near the picnic tables, hoping to find a posted phone number for highway assistance, or at least a map that might show him where he actually was relative to known landmarks. He left his truck running, unwilling to risk it not restarting in these impossible temperatures, and walked across the frozen parking lot to where 3 large information boards stood in a row, protected from weather by plastic covers that had fogged with condensation, making their contents difficult to see without wiping the surfaces clean. The first board should have displayed a highway map showing rest areas and services, but instead showed what appeared to be a complex spiral diagram, mathematical in nature, with his name written at the center point and various highway signs arranged around it like some kind of occult symbol, each sign displaying a different permutation of the letters in Marcus Holloway, as if someone had created an art installation exploring anagrams of his identity. The second board displayed what looked like a message written in hurried handwriting, not printed professionally, but scrawled as if by someone using a marker or grease pencil. Others have come, others have tried. The loop accepts, the loop retains. Drive forward or drive backward. Always arrive here. No exit exists, Marcus. And seeing his name appended to this ominous message made his heart race with adrenaline-fueled terror. The third information board showed a series of photographs, grainy and aged, depicting various trucks parked in this exact rest area, different makes and models spanning what appeared to be several decades of vehicle design evolution, and in each photograph, Marcus could see a driver standing beside their truck, face turned toward the camera, expression captured in a moment of confusion or fear, and with growing horror, Marcus realized that he recognized some of these vehicles from Trucker magazine. And news reports about missing drivers, unsolved disappearances that occurred along various highways across America, cases that had never been resolved because the drivers in their trucks had simply vanished without leaving any forensic evidence or logical explanation. Marcus ran back to his truck with a speed that left him gasping in the thin, freezing air, his mind racing through options that all seemed to lead nowhere. He could stay parked at this rest area indefinitely, waiting for help that might never come, slowly freezing or starving as his supplies ran out, or he could get back on the highway and see where it led, accepting that forward motion was his only real choice, even if that motion seemed to loop back on itself in ways that violated fundamental pure principles of geometry and physics. The professional driver in him, the part that had navigated countless difficult situations through logic and persistence, told him that sitting still was death, that movement at least provided the illusion of progress and maintained body heat and psychological momentum. He climbed back into his cab, secured all doors, checked all systems, and made the decision to continue driving forward on Interstate 77, reasoning that even an impossible loop had to have some kind of exit mechanism, some kind of solution that would reveal itself through observation and analysis, and that giving up was not an option as long as his truck had fuel and his body had strength. Marcus shifted into gear, released the parking brake, and guided his 18-wheeler back onto the highway entrance ramp, accelerating up to highway speed despite the fear gnawing at his rationality. Fear that wanted him to curl into a ball and hide, but which he forcefully suppressed through years of discipline and professional pride. The first sign appeared within 3 miles. "Welcome to the Marcus Loop, 40th iteration beginning," which confirmed his worst suspicion that he had traveled this stretch of road multiple times already, that the déjà vu he had experienced was not imagination, but actual repetition, that some force or phenomenon had trapped him in a recursive pattern that defied everything he understood about how roads and reality functioned. The word 40th particularly disturbed him because he consciously remembered only driving this route once tonight, which meant either his memory was being manipulated or time was functioning differently within this loop, allowing multiple iterations to occur without his awareness, and both possibilities terrified him in ways that challenged his sanity. Marcus began documenting everything he saw, speaking into his phone's voice recorder even though he had no signal to transmit the data, creating a verbal log of every sign, every landmark, every detail that might prove useful for understanding the pattern or communicating his situation to potential rescuers if he somehow escaped or if someone eventually found his truck. He described the mile markers, noting that they incremented normally up to marker 79, then suddenly jumped back to marker 37, creating a 42-mile loop that corresponded exactly to the number first displayed on that initial impossible sign. And the mathematical precision of the trap suggested intelligence behind it, purpose, deliberate design rather than natural phenomenon. Every iteration of the loop, which took approximately 41 minutes to complete at highway speeds, factoring in the slight deceleration through curves, presented slight variations that Marcus documented meticulously. Sometimes the dead lightning split tree appeared on the left shoulder instead of the right. Sometimes the rest area was illuminated and sometimes dark. Sometimes the temperature outside dropped another degree or two, while other times it remained constant at the impossible negative E8 degrees that his thermometer reported. The GPS continued providing directions that incorporated his name in increasingly disturbing ways. In 800 feet, Marcus will loop, approaching Marcus Spiral Center, destination Marcus Never, speaking in third person about him as if he were not the operator, but an external subject being discussed by the machine intelligence, on what Marcus estimated was his 7th conscious iteration through the loop. Having now accepted that he had somehow been trapped for hours without realizing it, he began noticing additional vehicles appearing on the highway, other trucks and cars that had not been present during earlier passes, and his initial surge of hope that he might flag down help, or at least confirm he was not hallucinating everything, quickly turned to dread when he observed these vehicles more carefully. Each vehicle appeared dated from different decades. A 1970s sedan with distinctive angular body styling, an early 2000s pickup truck, a 1980s era big rig similar to what Marcus had driven early in his career, all of them moving at identical speeds, maintaining perfect spacing between each other, as if controlled by some central coordination system. Marcus tried to pull alongside the nearest vehicle, the vintage sedan, hoping to make eye contact with its driver and perhaps communicate through hand signals or written signs. But as his truck drew even with the car, he saw that the driver's seat was occupied by what appeared to be a mannequin or statue, a human figure frozen in a driving position with hands locked on the steering wheel, face turned toward the windshield in an expression Marcus could not quite read at highway speeds. And when he honked his air horn repeatedly, the figure did not react, did not turn, did not acknowledge his presence in any way. He managed to glimpse the license plate, which read M. Holloway, followed by numbers that matched his birth year, which was impossible because that was not his actual license plate number. And the personalization of this phantom vehicle sent chills through his body that had nothing to do with the unnatural cold. Attempting to investigate the other vehicles yielded similar disturbing results. Each one displayed license plates featuring variations of his name or significant numbers from his life. Each contained a motionless driver figure that never deviated from its locked forward stare, and each vehicle seemed to occupy the highway in a way that prevented Marcus from exiting the pattern, boxing him into a specific lane and speed through their strategic positioning. When Marcus deliberately slowed his truck to 20 miles per hour, the other vehicles slowed proportionally, maintaining their relative positions, and when he accelerated to 75 miles per hour, they accelerated identically, making it impossible for him to break free from the formation or establish any different relationship to the loop structure. The highway signs evolved their messages beyond simple name displays, now presenting what appeared to be personal information. Marcus Holloway, born March 15, 1977, trucking license acquired. August 2001. 3 million miles logged, 0 miles remaining, which demonstrated that whatever intelligence controlled this phenomenon had access to detailed biographical data, knew intimate details about his professional history, and seemed to be making some kind of point about his journey reaching an end, a destination that was not physical, but perhaps existential. The specificity of the information eliminated any remaining possibility that this was random chaos or natural phenomenon. This was targeted, personal, designed specifically to trap him specifically in this specific location. Marcus noticed that his fuel gauge, which had shown 3/4 full when he first encountered the loop, was now reading just under half, meaning that despite the impossible physics of his situation, his truck was still consuming diesel at normal rates, which gave him a concrete deadline. He had perhaps 6 more hours of driving before running empty, before his truck stopped whether he wanted it to or not, before he would be stranded in whatever impossible space this loop occupied, vulnerable, and immobile in temperatures that would prove fatal within hours of his engine dying and his heater failing. Desperation drove Marcus to experiment with the loop's boundaries, testing what actions produced what results, approaching his predicament like a puzzle that could be solved through systematic investigation, rather than a supernatural trap that defied comprehension. He tried stopping in the middle of the highway, simply parking his truck across the lanes to see what would happen, and the moment he brought his vehicle to a complete stop on the road surface, all the phantom vehicles immediately vanished, disappearing as if they had never existed, leaving him completely alone on an empty highway that stretched into darkness in both directions. And when he accelerated back to highway speed, the phantom vehicles reappeared instantly, materializing into their in positions as if resuming from a paused state. He tried driving in reverse, slowly backing his truck along the shoulder to see if the loop could be traversed in the opposite direction, and discovered that moving backward caused all the highway signs to display their messages in reverse as well. Mirror writing that still spelled out his name and still counted down distances, but now approached from the opposite end of the numerical sequence. And more disturbingly, the phantom vehicles began driving in reverse as well, maintaining their format on around him, but moving backward along the highway at the same speed he was moving backward, creating a surreal scene that looked like footage played in rewind. During his 11th iteration, Marcus noticed that the rest area building had changed appearance, its architecture morphing from modern concrete construction to an older style with brick facing and wooden trim. Then on the 12th iteration, it appeared newer again, cycling through different design aesthetics as if the loop was not fixed in a single time period, but somehow rotating through multiple temporal versions of the same location. He stopped at the rest area on this iteration and rushed inside the restroom to see if the interior matched the exterior period styling, and found that it did, the facilities now featuring tile work and fixtures from what appeared to be the 1960s. Everything functional but dated, and when he emerged 10 minutes later and continued driving, he found himself in a version of the loop where the rest area had reverted to its modern appearance. The variation in temporal details suggested that the loop was not simply a spatial trap, but something more complex, perhaps pulling fragments from different time periods and assembling them into a coherent but fundamentally impossible highway that existed outside normal chronology. And Marcus began to wonder if other drivers who had been trapped here were somehow still present, if the phantom vehicles contained not mannequins, but actual trapped drivers from different eras, all looping simultaneously, sly and parallel iterations that occasionally intersected with his own. The thought that he might not be alone in his predicament provided some comfort, but also raised the horrifying question of how long someone could remain trapped in this loop, whether escape was even possible, or whether he was doomed to drive this 42-mile stretch of impossible highway until his fuel ran out, and he joined the collection of frozen ghost drivers whose photographs he had seen on the information board. As his fuel gauge dropped below the quarter tank mark, Marcus felt his experimental curiosity giving way to primal survival urgency, the understanding that his time for casual investigation was ending, and that he needed to either find the exit mechanism or accept that he would die in this truck, trapped in an impossible loop on a highway that did not exist on any map, becoming another unsolved disappearance that his colleagues would discuss in hushed tones at truck stops while wondering what had really happened to old Marcus Holloway, who vanished without a trace on Interstate 77. Marcus pulled over at the rest area once again, this time with the specific intention of studying the information boards more carefully, convinced that they contained clues rather than simple descriptions of his trap, that whoever or whatever had created this loop had embedded within it the instructions for escape, perhaps as a test, or perhaps as a sadistic game that gave its victims hope while making freedom nearly impossible to achieve. He brought a flashlight from his truck and systematically photographed every detail of all 3 boards, using his phone's camera to capture images even though he could not transmit them, creating documentation that would at least exist if his phone was ever recovered. The spiral diagram on the first board, when examined closely, revealed mathematical notations around its edges, formulae that Marcus did not fully understand, but which appeared to relate to topology and loop theory, concepts he vaguely remembered from a college mathematics course he had taken decades ago before dropping out to pursue trucking. And at the center of the spiral where his name was written, he noticed tiny additional text in almost microscopic print that required him to hold his flash, light at precisely the right angle to read. The loop ends where name becomes nameless, which sounded like a riddle or koan, deliberately cryptic, but suggesting that his identity itself was somehow the key to his imprisonment. The second board's handwritten message, when photographed and examined at maximum zoom on his phone's screen, revealed that the letters were not uniformly dark, that some letters appeared slightly lighter than others as if written with less pressure or fading ink, and when Marcus noted only these lighter letters in sequence, they spelled out, "Refuse your name at the center," which provided a clearer instruction but one that was maddeningly vague about practical implementation. What did it mean to refuse his name? How could he deny his identity? What specific action would constitute this refusal? And where exactly was the center of a loop that had no distinguishable beginning or end? The third board with its photographs of trapped drivers revealed something Marcus had missed in his initial panicked examination. Beneath each photograph was a date and a single word, and the words formed a progression: entered, confused, searching, understanding, attempting, failing, forgotten, suggesting a timeline of psychological states that trapped drivers progressed through. And Marcus calculated that based on his current state of understanding, he had perhaps 1 or 2 more stages before reaching forgotten, which he interpreted as the point where a driver's identity dissolved into the loop permanently, becoming one of the phantom vehicles that existed only as background elements in another driver's nightmare. Combining the clues from all 3 boards, Marcus developed a theory. The loop functioned by binding itself to a driver's identity, using their name as an anchor point that maintained the connection between the trapped driver and the impossible highway, and the only way to break free was to somehow reject or dissolve that identity marker at a specific location referred to as the center. The mile markers had ranged from 37 to 79 before resetting, making the mathematical cent approximately mile marker 58. And Marcus decided that on his next iteration through the loop, he would perform some kind of symbolic rejection of his identity at that specific location, though he was still uncertain what form that rejection should take. Marcus drove through the loop with renewed purpose, watching his odometer carefully, calculating exactly when he would reach the center point, preparing himself mentally for what he had decided to attempt, even though he acknowledged it might accomplish nothing, might be a completely incorrect interpretation of cryptic clues that themselves might be meaningless or deliberately misleading. As he approached mile marker 58, he reduced his speed to exactly 42 miles per hour, the number that kept appearing throughout his ordeal, and he began speaking aloud a renunciation that felt both silly and profoundly serious. I am not Marcus Holloway. I am not a name. I am not a driver. I am not an identity. I am consciousness experiencing a moment. I am nobody and everybody. I refuse the label. I reject the anchor. As he spoke these words, the phantom vehicles around him began to flicker, their solid appearances becoming translucent, revealing that they had always been projections or recordings rather than physical objects. And through their fading forms, Marcus could see other highways overlapping his current location, multiple versions of Interstate 77 existing simultaneously in the same space, each one containing its own trapped driver speaking their own renunciations, their own desperate MPTs to escape, and he realized that the loop was not linear but multidimensional, that he was not alone, but had always been surrounded by other victims whose iterations of the trap existed parallel to his own. At the exact moment Marcus's truck reached mile marker 58, he made his final symbolic gesture. He removed his commercial driver's license from his wallet, the document that bore his legal name and his professional identity, and he threw it out his window into the freezing night, watching it flutter and disappear into the darkness. And the instant that plastic card left his possession, the highway buckled, the road surface rippling like water disturbed by a dropped stone. The yellow senti, our lines writhing like living things. The phantom vehicles exploding into fragments of light that dissipated into the air, leaving no trace of their existence. The GPS screen shattered, not from physical impact but from some kind of internal overload, sparks flying from the unit as it attempted to process a position that was transitioning from impossible to possible, from paradox to coherence. And Marcus heard a sound like thousands of voices crying out simultaneously. All the other trapped drivers from all the other temporal iterations of the loop experiencing the same breakthrough moment, their collective release creating a resonance that he felt in his bones, in his teeth, vibrating through the truck's frame and his own body alike. For a moment that stretched subjectively into hours, though, objectively lasted only seconds, Marcus experienced a complete dissolution of his sense of self, became a point of awareness without personal history or individual identity, existed as pure perception without the boundaries that normally separated observer from observed. And in that moment he understood that the loop had never been about the highway at all, but about the human tendency to define ourselves through fixed identity markers. Trap ourselves in patterns of thought and behavior that repeated endlessly because we could not imagine existing any other way, and that the supernatural highway had been a physical manifestation of a psychological truth. Reality snapped back into familiar configuration with a violence that left Marcus gasping for breath, his hand still gripping the steering wheel, his truck still moving forward, but everything around him had changed in subtle and obvious ways simultaneously. The phantom vehicles were gone. The highway signs displayed normal city names and distance markers. His GPS unit was dark and dead, but his cell phone suddenly showed full signal strength and a flood of missed messages from his dispatcher as King why he had not checked in for over 14 hours. According to his phone's clock, he had lost an entire night and most of the following day to the loop, though subjectively it had felt like only 5 or 6 hours of driving, creating a temporal discrepancy that Marcus knew he could never adequately explain in any official report. The landscape around the highway had transformed from the barren, frozen wasteland he had been driving through to a normal West Virginia autumn scene, trees still bearing colorful leaves, temperature a reasonable 42 degrees rather than -8, and when Marcus checked his mirrors, he saw regular traffic behind him, normal vehicles driven by normal people going about their normal lives, completely unaware that just minutes earlier, this highway had been hosting an impossible supernature, phenomenon that trapped drivers across multiple temporal iterations. The ordinariness of everything struck him as almost offensive, as if reality was gaslighting him by refusing to acknowledge that something extraordinary had occurred, that he had experienced something that fundamentally challenged the nature of existence and identity. Marcus pulled off at the next exit, a normal highway exit leading to a small town called Petersville that appeared on his road atlas and matched the signs he had seen, and he parked at a brightly lit truck stop filled with other drivers refueling and taking breaks, the mundane atmosphere of commercial travel feeling surreal after his ordeal. He attempted to tell his story to another trucker, an older driver who was fueling his rig at the adjacent pump, but the words came out jumbled and unconvincing even to his own ears, sounding like the paranoid ramblings of someone suffering from exhaustion or mental breakdown. And the other driver politely excused himself with the kind of careful distance people use when they encounter someone they suspect might be unstable. Inside the truck stop, Marcus bought coffee and food, charged his dead GPS unit to see if it contained any record of the impossible route he had traveled, but the device refused to power on at all, its circuits apparently fried beyond repair by whatever had occurred during his escape from the loop. He checked news websites on the truck stop's Wi-Fi looking for reports of other drivers experiencing similar phenomena, searching for any validation that what he had experienced was real rather than an elaborate hallucination, but found nothing. No reports of mysterious highway loops, no missing truckers recently found or reported, just the usual traffic accidents and road construction notices that filled regional news feeds. The photographs he had taken at the rest area were gone from his phone's memory, the entire photo folder corrupted and displaying only error messages when he tried to access it, and even his voice recordings had been erased, leaving him with no physical evidence whatsoever of his ordeal, except his own memory and the psychological transformation he felt settling into his consciousness, a fundamental shift in how he perceived identity and reality that would stay with him permanently, whether he told prove his story or not. Marcus finished his coffee, walked back to his truck, and made a decision. He would complete his delivery to Columbus, would drive the remainder of his route as if nothing unusual had happened, would maintain his professional reputation and his career, rather than sacrifice everything by insisting on a truth that could not be proven and would not be believed. Marcus completed his delivery 3 hours later, unloading his cargo at the Columbus facility without mentioning his lost time or strange experience, accepting the receiving manager's signature on his delivery paperwork, and preparing to return home to North Carolina, where his wife and 2 grown daughters lived in a house he had purchased with 20 years of careful savings. As he walked back to his truck for the return journey, he noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under his windshield wiper, the kind of thing that made drivers think of parking tickets or commercial flyers. But when he unfolded the paper, he found a hand-drawn map showing Interstate 77 with a specific section highlighted, labeled simply, "Where Marcus Holloway became free," along with coordinates and a date, November 14, 2024. The handwriting matched the message he had seen on the information board inside the loop, which should have been impossible because that board existed in a place that no longer existed, or perhaps had never existed in the normal world. And the paper itself felt strange, too thick and textured to be ordinary notebook paper, almost like parchment from an earlier century. And when Marcus held it up to the light, he saw watermarks forming words. "You are not the first. You will not be the last. The low. OP moves. The loop learns. The loop evolves. But you, Marcus, are free." The personalization of the message and the confirmation that his experience had been objectively real rather than subjective hallucination hit him with overwhelming emotional force, and he sat in his truck for 20 minutes simply crying, releasing tension and fear and confusion that he had been suppressing through pure willpower since his ordeal began. When Marcus finally composed himself and started his engine for the return trip, his radio automatically tuned to a station he did not recognize, playing a song he had never heard before, and the lyrics seemed impossibly relevant to his experience, singing about highways that led nowhere, about travelers who lost their names, about the price of freedom being the surrender of identity, and he frantically tried to note the station frequency and song title, but the display showed only static numbers. That kept changing, digits rearranging themselves into patterns that spelled out, "Thank you, Marcus," before the radio died completely, joining his GPS in the category of electronics destroyed by proximity to the impossible. Over the following weeks, Marcus discovered that his experience had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. He no longer felt attachment to his own name, responding to it out of social convenience but not identifying with it internally. He became intensely aware of patterns and loops in daily life, recognizing how people trapped themselves in repetitive thoughts and behaviors without realizing they had options to break free, and he developed an ability to sense when other drivers had encountered similar phenomena, recognizing a particular expression in their eyes, a haunted awareness that marked them as fellow survivors of experiences that defied rational explanation. He began collecting their stories at truck stops, never judging, never doubting, simply documenting, creating an informal archive of supernatural highway encounters that he stored in a private journal, knowing that someday someone might need this information, might be searching for answers about why highways sometimes became impossible, why roads sometimes rejected the normal rules of space and time. 6 months after his ordeal, Marcus was driving through Montana on a completely different highway, when he saw a road sign displaying letters that formed his name for just an instant before rearranging themselves into normal text, and he realized that the loop had not been destroyed, but had simply released him, that it still existed somewhere in the quantum uncertainty between mapped reality and impossible geography, still waiting for drivers who fit whatever criteria activated its trap, still evolving and learning and perfecting its mechanisms. He pulled over immediately and called every driver he had documented in his journal, warning them about specific highway sections to avoid, sharing what he had learned about identity and escape, knowing that his warnings would sound paranoid to most people, but hoping that the ones who needed to hear this information would recognize the truth beneath the seemingly impossible claims. Marcus never drove Interstate 77 again, choosing longer alternate routes that added hours to his trips rather than risk re-entering the loop. And though his dispatcher questioned his route choices and his efficiency declined slightly, he never explained his real reasons, maintaining his reputation as a reliable, if slightly eccentric driver who had his own particular preferences about which roads to travel. In quiet moments alone in his truck cab during long night drives across America's heartland, Marcus sometimes wondered if he had truly escaped, or if perhaps he was still in the loop, experiencing an elaborate simulation of normal life that would eventually reset, revealing itself as just another layer of the trap, and the uncertainty became something he learned to live with, a permanent existential vertigo that reminded him never to take reality for granted, never to assume that the road ahead would necessarily lead where maps promised it should lead, because highways sometimes had their own agendas, their own hunger for drivers who matched their specific inexplicable criteria, and freedom was always provisional, always one wrong turn away from becoming imprisonment in a loop that stretched not through space, but through the infinite variations of identity itself, teaching those who survived that names were anchors, and anchors could drown you if you clutched them too tightly when the row beneath your wheels decided to become water, decided to become spiral, decided to become the kind of forever that tested whether consciousness could exist without the comfortable boundaries of self, whether the essential I am could survive when stripped of every modifier that followed those two words, whether Marcus or anyone could be nobody and everybody simultaneously, and whether that state was freedom or simply a different form of trap that felt like freedom, only because the cage was infinite.